I've finally gotten around to doing something that I've wanted to do for a while, which is making a steady rest for my lathe. A steady rest is used to provide stability for longer pieces when turning. The steady rest can be placed at the center of a long spindle or at the unsupported end when using a chuck. I started by making a good pattern of what my steady rest would be shaped like. For my pattern, I used some scrap 1/4 inch plywood, and I made it as precisely as possible since this would serve as a template for my final pieces. With the template complete, I traced it out on some scrap Baltic birch plywood. I intentionally cut proud of the line since the final shaping would be done on the router table. Using masking tape and superglue, I affixed the template to my Baltic birch piece. I then used a pattern cutting bit on the router table to get the first of 2 of these rings to its final shape. I used a 1/4 inch trim router bit to clean up the inside corners that were too large for the fat flush cutting bit I used earlier. Before I took the template off, I transferred the center lines that divide the ring into thirds. These lines I'm marking here show where the support arms will pass through the steady rest rings. I used some 1/2 inch thick plywood to beef up the rings and to reduce the amount of Baltic birch plywood that I need to remove for the arms. Just like earlier, I cut these parts a little proud of the line. The ring itself will serve as the template to trim them flush. It was about impossible to get a decent camera angle on this. I used a trim router with a bearing guide to get these slots deep enough for the support arms. A little hand tool work cleaned up that last bit. Before joining the 2 rings, I added holes for the clamping knobs on the outside ring. Then both halves were glued together, blood and all. After it was dry, I sanded off the blood and glue squeeze out. The edges were eased with an 1/8 inch roundover. With the main part of the ring done, I started work on the clamping base. To tighten the clamp, I 3D printed a large knob that would accept a carriage bolt. Next, I made the lower part of the clamp that would attach the steady rest to the lathe bed rails. This part would require a captive nut for the clamping mechanism carriage bolt to thread into. The tolerances on this were fairly tight, and I really didn't want that top piece to slide around when it glued, so I used screws to clamp. The clamp mechanism worked pretty well, but I didn't like how the steady rest rings could still move around a little bit. I solved this problem by adding stop blocks to the lower part of the clamp. I used 2 layers of masking tape to create a small gap between the stop blocks and the upper part of the steady rest. I did this so the fit wouldn't be too tight. For the arms themselves, I cut up some scrap epoxy-coated steel box section. I had these left over as unneeded pieces from a fence gate hardware kit. Each arm needed a channel cut into it for the adjustment clamp. I made some small block nuts out of plywood and modified T-nuts. These will receive the arm adjustment bolts. I 3D printed knobs to make turning the support arm adjustment bolts easier. My last pieces to 3D print were the wheel holders themselves and plugs for the opposite ends of the support arms. My wheels, bearings, and axles are leftover parts from a luggage wheel repair kit. Time will tell if this was a wise use for them. With all the individual support arm pieces done, I epoxied the arm together. The final part of construction was to install the arms into the ring. I did make one final modification. If you compare these two pictures, you'll notice the adjustment rod clamps move outward. I did this by adding holes closer to the edge of the ring to gain an additional ½ inch of capacity for my eventual workpieces. Now it was time to test the steady rest out. For what will eventually be a wooden mug, this steady rest was at capacity. I tightened the support arms down with my tailstock and live center still in place. With everything lined up and tight, I removed the tailstock. To be honest, I am not a very good or experienced turner, so I didn't really know what was going to happen. In a previous video, I tried to do this without a steady rest and nearly lost the piece. With a steady rest, this worked amazing. Okay, I want to talk about a few things that I like and I don't like about this. One, I think these 3D printed brackets worked out really well. I'm happy about that. I'm really happy about the clamping mechanism, but I'm not so happy about how long I made this. And it would be easy enough to trim down, which I probably will. What I found is I couldn't get the tool rest quite as close to the piece as I wanted to. So that's an issue. But I think the glaring big problem with this design is it's too small. This is the maximum size of anything I can fit in there, and diameter is probably about 5 inches. And looking at it, I think if I brought the ring down almost to bed height and maybe redesign this a little bit, I could increase my capacity by probably 2 inches of diameter on the piece. That's the big problem. The screws on these clamps are definitely a little bit too short. I was using what I had on hand, so I'm going to be getting a few longer screws for that, which will make engaging this clamp easier. Looking at it, I'm also not sure it needed to be quite so thick, but I think a little bit more robust is probably for the best. Overall though, as a functional piece or a functional jig for smaller items like spindles and beer tap handles and stuff, I think it's great. For larger things like this mug I'm working on, it's right at capacity. For a lathe this size, it's already limited so much. I think making this thing bigger around would make it a little more functional, a little better for every item instead of just smaller ones. But again, as I said, overall, really happy with the design, really happy with how it worked out. Glad I used up some scrap hardware and wood. And if you're still this far into the video, thanks for watching.